Well, good evening and welcome to the 9th annual Judge Guido Calabresi Fellowship in Religion and Law. I want to express my appreciation to the Lehrman Institute for their generosity in making this event possible. Lou Lehrman was not able to be here, but he sends his warm regards. Many alumni around the country have been very supportive in advancing an extended program of Catholic life here at Yale. I'm grateful to all the alumni, and in a very special way to Lou and to Guido for all they have done here and continue to do here. The Calabresi Fellow for 2015 is John Sexton, the 15th President of New York University and the Benjamin Butler Professor of Law. He is the author of How Free Are We? What the Constitution Says We Can and Cannot Do, an accessible book on individual rights and liberties, the history and development of the Constitution, and the structure of the federal system. More on my level, his book, Baseball as a Road to God, Seeing Beyond the Game, was published in March of 2013, and it's based on a popular seminar he teaches in the spring semester at NYU. I will think of the 7th inning stretch during the sign of peace at Mass on Sunday. Bill Moyers, in an interview with John Sexton, said, "In the Church of Baseball, John Sexton is one of the preeminent theologians." After his lecture, remarks will be given by Harold Coe, the distinguished scholar in residence at NYU Law School and former Dean and Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. Professor Coe is an expert on public and private international law, national security law, and human rights. We're delighted you are both here with us tonight. After Professor Coe's remarks, there will be some time for audience questions. Please line up at the microphone on either side. And as I do all the time, I remind you, please no speeches or long comments, just a quick question. And there are also copies of Mr. Sexton's book in the corridor for your purchase and signing, if you wish. The title of today's lecture is "A Secular University as a Force for Ecumenism." Please join me in welcoming a legal scholar and a preeminent theologian in the Church of Baseball, John Sexton.
In the book, Baseball as a Road to God, I make an argument which, in a way, circles back to Guido. I have to say that in 1979, the year I was graduating from law school, just before I clerked, I did the circuit hoping to become what I am, which is a professor of law. And Yale was kind enough to bring me up here. I probably visited most, if not all, of the top 10 law schools in the country, a few others as well. And if you know something about that hiring process, you go through a day of office interviews, one-on-one, generally about 45 minutes in length, and then you teach a class to the faculty. So I probably had one-on-one talks with well over 100 of the leading law professors in the country at the time. I will never forget the time sitting in that comfortable chair in your office for what was the most dazzling 45 minutes of any of those interviews. I'm sure I'm just one in a long list of people who would say that. I, of course, knew Guido before that by reputation. His scholarship had to be read by anyone that was serious about the law. But that day was the first time I came to know him as a person. And from 1979 on, he's been my role model. He is, for all of us who were law school deans, Harold would agree with this, I'm sure, the dean of deans. He's the standard by which we all judge ourselves. That's true, but it's also true, as I've said about him publicly before, that he is, as a human being, a standard by which I judge myself. So it's a wonderful thing to be here in this place, a place of faith, a place where the spiritual is taken very, very seriously, to deliver anything that amounts to words rather than a lecture in his name. It's an honor for me to carry that title. Thank you, my friend, for all you've contributed to my life. Now, there's another interesting way in which this all connects, because Guido was a Rhodes Scholarship classmate of a dear friend of mine, Ronald Dworkin. The two of them were the stars of their group, and I was privileged as I came to NYU in 1981 to be part of the most phenomenal recruiting class. You know, each year when college teams recruit the next year's athletes, the magazines and the sports rate the incoming class, and there's no question, absolutely no question, that the NYU incoming class of faculty in 1981 will be remembered as the greatest ever to come to NYU. And it's not because I was in that class or that there were two or three others of us coming in the class, but in that class came Ronnie Dworkin and Tony Amsterdam as well. And if you had those two people coming, you just rode their coattails. But Ronnie connects to tonight then through the book Baseball is a Road to God. Now, I'm not to talk to you about that book tonight, but I should say to you that when I wrote that book, and this will bring me back to where I started, when I wrote that book, I was concerned. I was concerned about writing the book. I was concerned because in it, I reveal myself as a person who takes spirituality and religion seriously. And this was known by my colleagues at NYU Law School. It was known by my colleagues at the university. It was certainly known by my students, because my classes tend to deal. I'm a dean and a president who has always taught a full schedule, sometimes more than a full schedule for a research university. So last year I taught 6 courses. This year I'm teaching 7 courses. But most of my classes intersect in some way with religion, usually religion and government, but as you were told, also religion and baseball. And in those classes, I do divulge to my students, because I want them to know the place from which I come, that I'm a Catholic. I'm a member of the Catholic Church, a proud member of the Catholic Church. The popes would not always have embraced me. So I'll be a little more specific here, not knowing who it is I'll alienate or attract. But I identify, I'm a product of John the 23rd. My 4 years of college were 4 of the 5 years of the Vatican Council. And then in 1963, I began to study for my PhD in religion. I was, before I went to law school, the chairman of a religion department at a Catholic college. And Teilhard de Chardin had been on the Fordham campus when I was a student, and he had affected certainly all of the teachers I had for my doctorate. My heroes were people like Karl Rahner and Schillebeck and Kung and the authors of the Dutch Catechism. This was my brand, and after John the 23rd, I waited for a long time until we got Francis. I remember that my alma mater, Fordham, had chosen to give me an honorary degree and had asked me to give the commencement speech at their graduation the June after Benedict was named. And in February, just after I had agreed to give that commencement speech the following June, I picked up the New York Times on Sunday to see in the Week in Review 10 pictures on page 4 of theologians that Benedict had silenced. And there were Rahner and Kung and Schillebeck. 5 of the 10 were people that I used to assign in every one of my classes. And then there was the sixth. The sixth picture I looked at was my first client. After leaving the Supreme Court and coming to NYU, my college roommate and I represented a man named Charles Curran in a lawsuit against Catholic University. The first named defendant in the lawsuit was the Pope. My Dominican nun aunt said, "How can my nephew be suing the Pope?" I said, I intend to depose the Pope. But we won. Charles Curran had been stripped of his tenure by Catholic University, a pontifical university. That's why the Pope was the first named defendant. We won that lawsuit, and Charlie, who was an obedient priest, if his bishop had ever said to him, "I want you to recant," he would have recanted. In fact, he hadn't written anything on the subject for about 20 years when he was stripped of his tenure. He's still alive, you know. He's a professor, a chaired professor at SMU, Southern Methodist University. Now, figure that one out. But in any case, I hadn't been public about these things, but Fordham asked me after that February to give this commencement speech, and I felt called. Somebody had to speak out. That the church was a church of faith, yes, but faith and reason. And what better place to do that than at the Jesuit University that had given me my bachelor's degree and my master's degree and my PhD in religion. And within sight of Murray Weigel Hall, which I visited for Mass twice a week because my most beloved teachers were there in that senior care facility. What better place? And my high school debate coach, Father Jim Giacomo, called me up about a month before the graduation. He said, "I can tell you're thinking about speaking out, and you should. Somebody must speak out, and the Catholic University presidents can't, but you can." And it was my Jewish wife. And I should say to you that the most magnificent person I ever met was a Jewish woman. And fortunately, I was able to persuade her to marry me, and we were more in love every day until her death. It'll be 9 years ago in January. And we raised our children Jewish. And our son married an Italian Catholic. But she converted to Judaism to honor Lisa. The day she converted was September the 11th, 2001. They were walking down LaGuardia Street when the two planes flew over their head, and she decided to still go to the mikveh for the conversion. So our three grandchildren, since descendancy passes in Judaism through the mother, are Jewish. So my sister's husband, who's Irish Catholic like me, says, "Not since Abraham as a Gentile begat as many Jews as John." So we're an ecumenical family, but my Jewish wife said to me, "You can't deliver that speech. You have no right to co-opt the graduation, and you've always said that your focus is on NYU. And as long as you're dean or president of NYU, that's your focus. And this will get you into a collateral. You'll be on Nightline because somebody will have spoken out. And we're in vitro parents. So I speak from the heart to the Church of Life that condemns in vitro fertilization as the equivalent of abortion. In fact, we're not only in vitro parents, but we're in vitro 3 times grandparents. So this is an issue of importance to me. So I knew the speech would get attention if I gave it, and I knew Lisa was wiser than me. So it still sits. I've only 4 times in my life, her eulogy, this speech, 1 or 2 others, written out a speech in advance. And it still stands in my office as the unpublished, ungiven Fordham commencement speech. If you promise not to circulate it, if you email me, I'll send you a copy of it, okay? But it was, and now I'm going to weave back Harold, who was my student, knows my ways. These 2 magnificent people right here who were my students. Hello, it's good to see you. Come on. Come on, Corey. They know my ways. It's kind of Guido-esque. I'm just a Guido knockoff. But I'll weave back here because, so Lisa died in January of 2007. And Bill Moyers, with whom she had worked a lot, pressed me to be more public about my spirituality. And I said, no, not so long as I'm president of NYU. And he said, well, you must. To honor her, you must. And then a few friends, Doris Kearns Goodwin and Tom Oliphant, began to press me about publishing the book Baseball as a Road to God, which of course inherently involved that. And I was nervous about it. I was quite nervous about it. But, you know, we're an elevator university. You know, we're a vertical community. I remember returning to my people on move-in day after Katie, my daughter, had moved in as a freshman at Yale, and I said, you know, they got us into the dorms in 15 minutes at Yale. And they said, yes, they don't have to get the students into elevators and up 20 floors and stop all the traffic in the city and so forth. I was coming down the elevator, and that other great NYU philosopher, Tom Nagel, who's my upstairs neighbor, was there. And it was maybe March, and I always fascinated by Tom, and I said to him, what is it you're working on? He said, I'm working on a book I'm calling The Mind and the Cosmos. And in it, I'm going to make an argument that the ways we know today will look very primitive 50 years from now. I think there's almost a religion of secularism, he said to me, that's developed. And I said, would you mind if I read the draft? And I read his draft, and he made 2/3 of the argument that I make in Baseball as a Road to God. He said in there are the things that we know through the brilliance and the wonder of science. And then there are the things that we don't yet know, but will come to know through the brilliance and the wonder of science and our cognitive gifts from the Creator. But he said, and this is what became controversial about his books, but he said, we're not simply going to know them in the ways we know today. There'll be whole new ways of knowing that are undiscovered by us yet. And for that, he got excoriated. For that, the New York Review of Books and the cognoscenti condemned him. Now, fortunately, the reviews of his book had not come out. I'd read it in draft, so the reviews weren't out yet. So emboldened by the fact that Tom Nagel had gone that far, I went one step farther, which was to say, and yet there are truths beyond that that are unknowable in our cognitive terms, that can be known only through faith. They are the ineffable truths, that Lisa had not convinced me that she loved me through a syllogism. It was something I knew more profoundly, as I know other truths more profoundly through faith than I can through cognition and the attempts to reduce the ineffable to our own anthropomorphic or cognitive terms. Now, you know, I'm not Tom Nagel, so no one noticed that I had gone a step beyond, so I didn't get excoriated. In fact, we didn't get a single bad review. But the review that made me go forward, even after I had completed the draft, was your Magdalen College classmates, Ronnie Dworkin's. Because Ronnie was by no means, Guido will tell you this, a perfect person. He, among other things, is a Red Sox fan. But Ronnie, I had visited Ronnie in that last summer before he died. I would visit him frequently. I visited him at the Cape, I visited him in London. I gave him a copy of the draft, and he wrote to me, you must publish this. Ronnie Dworkin said, you must publish this. And that was enough. But I was nervous because it's not fashionable for the president of a secular university to identify as a person of faith. That's one reason I come to you joyfully today. And I would have come to you joyfully a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago, because once that book went out, I felt comfortable identifying like that. I had noticed early on in my presidency that when I referred to graduation as a sacrament, or to the academic year as liturgical, or to teaching as a vocation, that it would cause nervous twitches. And of course, the more the twitches occurred, the more delighted I became in proliferating my language. After Lisa died, it became fashionable in New York for people to try to get me to date. And I tried to explain the permanence of our love and the continued fulfillment that I drew from our love. C.S. Lewis's great book, A Grief Observed, it was great solace to me in those moments. And it was at a lunch encounter at Yale that our daughter Katie, having lunch with the daughter of a magnificent woman, a person I admire a great deal, okay, gloriously intelligent and beautiful in every way, who had asked her daughter to arrange with Katie that the two of them introduce us. That my daughter came up with the family statement on this, which is, there's more chance that my father will become a Jesuit priest than that he will date again. And you know, there's an exception for widowers, even widowers with children in canon law. And I've toyed with this idea because of the delight it would give me, because I would wear the collar around the NYU campus just for the joy of it and seeing those ticks get all the more. Now, that having been said, by way of giving you a flavor of whence I come, let me spend just 10 or 15 minutes on the topic, if that's okay. And because I can say this to an audience like this quite elliptically, I think. So I have, for about 7 or 8 years now, frequently referred, I think when I first met the two of you, I referred to NYU as the world's first ecumenical university. Before that, I began to refer to New York City as the world's first ecumenical city. And I think that this word ecumenical, which at least I came to know first, a person with his vocabulary probably knew it from the age of 7, but I came to know it first through the Vatican Council and as a kind of theological perspective. A great, great man who was my high school teacher, a man named Daniel Berrigan that would be known to some of you. In 1956, in a high school classroom in Brooklyn, wrote on the blackboard the words, "Extra ecclesia nulla salus." Outside the church, there's no salvation. And when I went up to him after class and said, "Father Berrigan, does that mean that my best friend Jerry Epstein can't go to heaven?" Danny Berrigan, so this is not some, troglodyte. Not yet the political activist in 56, still a poet, but Danny Berrigan said, if you do not baptize him, he will not go to heaven. They were still teaching us about limbo, and it wasn't the dance. Okay. And the idea that somehow Pope John and Teilhard and others brought us from that place intellectually to a place where we understood that we could appreciate our own faith more by entering into genuine dialogue's not a good enough word, but genuine engagement where you place yourself in the other's position and try to both see yourself and your faith as they see it, not because you will depart from your spot, but so that you can understand it and the mystery of faith through more than the one window you were given by birth, but through the many facets of a diamond. That powerful heuristic of ecumenism was formative in the intellectual lives of many of us, and certainly in my intellectual life. So in 1963, when I started work on my doctorate in religion, my mentor was the leading expert in the world at the time on a single medieval theologian, St. Anselm. So my first encounter with Jaroslav Pelikan was not his great book on the university, which I would read much later, but was Jaroslav Pelikan, the patristic scholar, par excellence, as we were sent down to study the documents. And That man, that mentor of mine, Ewart Cousins, moved from 1963 to 1983, my second year on the faculty of New York University Law School, where he was inviting me to the United Nations for the publication of his 60-volume work on world spirituality, which had 25 faith traditions in it. That was the migration that was captured in that word ecumenism. And Ewart attended daily mass till he died. He never gave up his faith spot, but he came to appreciate his own faith better by understanding and appreciating other faiths. This powerful theological notion or heuristic, it strikes me, is today for us a powerful progressive social model. So here I get to New York City. Somewhere in the 90s, as my thoughts on this were developing, I got involved in trying to bring the Olympics to New York. I was the third wheel of two very, very powerful marketing minds, a fellow named Dan Doctoroff, who later became deputy mayor, and a fellow named Jay Kriegel, who had been a deputy mayor under John Lindsay. And these two friends of mine got me involved, and they would come to the breakfast table in each of our meetings with extraordinary data about New York, such as 40% of the citizens of New York City were born in other countries. New York City was, and I think still may be, the only, but it was the first city in the world to have a neighborhood for every country in the world populated by people that were born in that country. So you could literally visit any country in the world by getting on the subway or the buses and going out, and you could hear the language, and you could eat the food, and you could hear the music and the prayers and everything. And it'd be an old-timer that would be delighted to tell you as much as you wanted to know about Lithuania or any other country that you want to visit. And the interesting thing is, as we develop the punchline for the Olympics, come to New York, the world's second home. Every team will have a neighborhood. Okay? I said, wait a minute, that's a story of our city as the first ecumenical city, because those people view themselves as New Yorkers. I remember I gave some version of a talk like this in Amsterdam once, and the Prime Minister came to visit me and said, I have to learn more about this because members of my parliament still call themselves Turks, or they still identify with their antecedent nationality. Whereas in New York, we Irish are very proud of our heritage. Even the Italians are proud of their heritage. But we view ourselves as New Yorkers. So this notion began to become real for me of New York City as a community of communities. And this was at the time when I was thinking, I was chosen, and many of my colleagues would rush to tell you, I was chosen in an unusual way as the president of NYU. I became president in May 2001. There was no search. There had been a 4-year process of the trustees attempting to persuade me that it was a good idea for the university and for me to become president of the university. Harold and Christy were some of my advisors at this time. I was extremely reluctant. My answer to them in short was, I was put on earth to be a parish priest, not a cardinal. And the pastoral role of the dean, very much in the tradition of Guido. Half my time was spent advising students or faculty or security guards or whatever about marital problems, family problems, whatever. And it made you a damn good dean, didn't it, Guido? Because if you helped somebody with a marital problem and you went and asked them to teach an extra section of civil procedure, they were going to teach that section of civil procedure, right? Or even if you went to them and said, I know this appointment vote is a tough one for you. It made you. And I said, this is not transportable to a community where there are 20,000 new students every year. At the law school, we knew every student's name and could greet them in the hall. And I said, the cardinal becomes a cartoon. And I've lived the life of a cartoon for these last 14 years. And it's painful in some ways. So we were in that period where the trustees were trying to convince me it would be useful for me to do this, because the Jesuits had taught me you must live a useful life. And I was wondering what was useful about being president of NYU. I could explain to myself what was useful about being dean of NYU Law School, because the idea of creating Tocquevillian humanitarian lawyers with the powerful instrument of law, that I could get. But making NYU a little better, there are great universities out there. There are plenty of them. If the professors don't do it here, they'll do it someplace else. What I was asking myself was the ratio studiorum. The business people would call it, you could never say this to the faculty, the value proposition. Why would it be a useful life? And suddenly it occurred to me that what we had viewed as a liability, which was the absence of a campus. We don't have a single gate. We were always living in the shadow of the campus up at Columbia. Shangri-La, once you got through the gates. And here we were. Then suddenly I said, wait a minute. And I found a phrase that Albert Gallatin founded. Nobody had ever noticed this phrase before, that NYU was founded to be in and of the city. And I said, wait a minute. If this is the first ecumenical city, and we are in and of it, we don't have a campus. And we began to revel in the fact that there wasn't a single gate, there wasn't an escape place. I used to say we have no grass on campus. Then I realized that was a double entendre. So I say no blades of grass on campus. And that was the key move. That everything else just flowed from that, including NYU Abu Dhabi and NYU Shanghai and the study away sites on 6 continents now. So it's an organic circulatory system that looks very much like the Italian Renaissance. It's not a branch campus system. It is an attempt to be an ecumenical university where the students and faculty and even staff can qualify to move around and see the world in all of its wonder from the many vantages. And it's a metaphor for New York City, so it was a natural extrapolation for us. And I have to say that having spent last weekend in Singapore with my successor, Andy Hamilton, who of course was the provost here and then went to be the vice chancellor at Oxford, who will now succeed me in January at NYU, for the opening of Yale NUS. This notion of seeing the world through the eyes of as many different vantage points as you can. This ecumenical notion, now not as a theological function, but as a secular progressive. It's important because the world is miniaturizing, and we are now deeply interdependent and deeply interconnected, and we can't avoid others. It is impossible. You can build the gates as high as you want. You can build the walls as high as you want. You cannot keep them, whoever they are, out. And their effect will be felt in your life even if they're not physically present in your life. Whether it be through the wages they're paid that produce the products and the job law, whatever, okay? It's all, and it's not just economic. It's cultural. And in this miniaturized world, we've got to figure it out in this century. We've got to figure it out whether we're going to help move humankind through a second axial age. An axial age where we develop now out of the wonder of individuality a re-community. We're no longer tribes, but now a community of communities. The interlocking elements of a watch each part identifiable, but the whole greater than the sum of the parts. Are we going to go there to that ecumenical point omega to which Teilhard and others called us? Or are we going to have a clash of civilizations where we use the differences among us not to rejoice, but to cause us to fight? And look, there's an awful lot of evidence that the second is the way we're going. But universities have always been on the side of optimism, of advance, of understanding, of building bridges and tunnels and communities of communities. We've always operated in a global network. I think the idea of a university, among the kinds of universities that Jaroslav Pelikan was talking about in his great book, A Refrain on Newman's Idea of the University, the quintessentially excellent universities, the Yales of the world, the NYUs of the world, I hope. These places have got to be the vanguard of the quixotic, perhaps, mission of teaching humankind to elevate itself in a community of communities. So I think this notion that was familiar to many of us, certainly the older among us, because of John the 23rd as a theological matter, it returns to us now as a secular matter and as an invitation to some of the great universities in the world, Yale among them. Now, there are the critics. Believe me, I have played the role of the cartoon. I've played the role of the target. Upon deep analysis, and if there's anyone who wants to raise these issues, I'm very happy to, I think the criticism is revealed as some version of extra ecclesia nulla salus. You don't embrace my orthodoxy, and I want to close my ears and close my eyes to anything that will challenge that or be different from it. But that we can discuss. That we can discuss. The one thing I can tell you is this. These two are better students in their studies here because they've been part of a student body where the largest national contingent was 15% of the student body, 15%, where out of 1,000 students roughly that were there when you folks left, 112 countries were represented. Every sector of society, including people out of tribal villages. Okay, at graduation last year, under a program where we wanted each kid to have at least one person at graduation, and we knew that there were some kids who wouldn't have anyone at graduation, so we paid for one round-trip plane ticket. There were 34 people. 34 of the 140 students had a person there who had never been on a plane before in their lives. Okay, I'm talking about people who had seen their families destroyed in front of them in the Rwandan genocide, or who had walked 5 days to Addis Ababa to get into the high school. This was every sector of society, and to sit next to those kids in class, to live with them in the dorms, to go to Prague or Accra or Buenos Aires to the study away sites, this is ecumenism in action, and they will be better at whatever they do for the rest of their lives, and hopefully they'll be part of a network that will stay together and help us build the community of communities. So that's the net for me. It's all a knockoff of stuff very familiar with you. And with that, I'll turn it over to a person who was, I should say, a student in the very first law school class I taught, who propelled me into my career in law, and that is my beloved friend, Harold. Thank you.
Thank you. Every word. Thank you. So to follow John Sexton to the podium is a little bit like being the closing act for Beyonce. Everybody is exhausted with excitement, and they're not sure how much you're going to contribute to the net experience. But let me say two things. One is about the fundamental connection between John Sexton, our speaker today, the Guido Calabresi Fellow, and Guido Calabresi, who are two people who are great teachers of mine, although collectively they taught me for a total of 2 weeks. When I was a first-year student at Harvard Law School taking civil procedure, one day the professor announced that he was not going to be there and there would be another professor in his place. And the next day in came someone who looked very much like John Sexton, taught us the subject of joinder in civil procedure, and it was totally fascinating. And afterwards, the students were in the hallway saying, you know, I think he's a better professor than the one we have. At which point someone said, that guy is a second-year student. And it was true. John had been, was in the school. He was a second-year student. He'd become friendly with our professor. The professor invited him to teach the class. And because of John, I went on to teach procedure myself, as some of my students here well know. And I've known him for now 35 years. An association exceeded really only by my association with Guido Calabresi, who I've known for more than half a century. And these are two of the most impressive and most influential people in my life, and for anybody here who knows them both. But the point that I want to emphasize is the three ways in which they are deeply similar. First, they are transformative educational leaders. Guido is a great teacher, he is a great judge, but is, I think we will all acknowledge, one of the greatest deans in American history, and certainly the dean against which every dean of Yale Law School measures, or hopes they are not measured, in the years ahead. John Sexton became a transformative dean and now a transformative university president, thinking about how universities should change the world. Second, these are both people of great faith. I noticed this when Guido, in trying to recruit Christy and me to come to Yale Law School, decided that he would take us out for a meal. And it was to the soup kitchen here at Morehouse, which of course was the reason why my wife decided that this was where we were going to come. Because Guido knew that I wasn't the one who needed convincing, and he knew that the thing that would make my wife want to come was the vision of service, and the vision that we were here for more than ourselves. John is a person who, as you've just heard, is really a secular pope, and who leads an extraordinary life in which he is genuinely blessed. I know this because I've driven in the cars with John, and he does not use his hands to drive. You think I'm kidding. I have driven many miles with John Sexton with him gesticulating with both hands in a stick shift car. And at one point I said to John, we're in New York City. John, don't you think you ought to hold the wheel? And he said, no problem, I'm driving with my knee. And he said, I used to drive down the West Side Highway eating a steak dinner. Now, there are many scary moments on these rides, as you can imagine, but the one thing I realized was, as a person of great faith, who did a doctorate in theology, who wrote his student note on the constitutional definition toward a constitutional definition of religion, who made his specialty the First Amendment religion clauses. It was a logical step as a university president to direct his own work toward the secular university as a force for ecumenism. The third respect in which Guido Calabresi and John Sexton are deeply similar is in their extraordinary zeal and zest for service and for helping those who have nothing. And I know this because the reason that my brothers and I went to the local school, Hopkins, was because Guido Calabresi, who did not even know us, wrote us letters of recommendation. It was the instinct that leads the two of them to help the least privileged person in the room, even though the most privileged person in the room is the one who's trying to talk to them. And it is the same instinct that leads them to give their students the highest priority in their lives, higher than anyone else. I will tell you a remarkable story. It was mentioned that last year I had the good fortune to visit at NYU, and I decided that since it would be the only time I could do it when John was the president, I would spend time at all three of the campuses, NYU New York, NYU Abu Dhabi, and NYU Shanghai. And at each place, I talked to students. And I would ask them, which professor could you go to if you had a problem? And in each campus, the student said, John. And I said, John Sexton, the president of the university? The person who has 50,000 students and thousands of faculty? And they all said, John. And I said, but surely you haven't spent time with him. They said, we spent a lot of time with him. Every single one of them. On 3 continents. It was one of the most startling and shocking. At that point, I thought, I'm having enough trouble on one continent. So, but I relate this because when you travel the world, Corey Myers, my student this year, went to NYU Abu Dhabi, and when I knew that John was coming to give this lecture, I wrote to him, asking whether he and Samir Jaywant, who is our other Yale Law student from NYU Abu Dhabi, wanted to be here to see John. Corey said, I have not had a chance to hear from John in 5 months. I'm used to hearing from him every day in some form or another, and so that's why he's here, and that's why these are two very special teachers. Guido, I don't have to tell you, is probably the greatest torts teacher who ever lived. And it is because this deep personal connection he has with every single student he's taught. And that he values the students and what they learn from him as his highest accomplishment in life. So, it is so fitting, and this is the first half of what I want to say, that these two remarkable individuals are connected in this way. They have been connected before, but now that John has given this lecture, it is, to me, extremely fitting. There's no one who could be more fitting as the Guido Calabresi Fellow than John Sexton. So what is the second half of what I want to say? It is the vision of the university that both of them share, where the central question is not, what do I become, but who do I serve? And this is something that I heard from Guido in every single statement he made as dean, in every single statement he's ever made. How do I serve? This is the goal of the university. Or as Kingman Brewster once said, I didn't become president of Yale to preside over a finishing school on Long Island Sound. The goal is to prepare and send people into the world with ideas who will make the world better. That is what you've heard from John today. What is the goal of the university? To create and develop useful ideas as a community of communities. Now, in some way, this is a missionary thought, and in some way, both Guido and John are missionaries. But what I wanted to focus on is the idea that I saw very graphically at NYU, Abu Dhabi, and at NYU Shanghai, which is the value of great Western universities reaching out to countries that have not had liberal education to set up new headquarters and enclaves. Now, it's easy to be very critical of this, and in our own community, many are. Critical of Yale, NUS, which I have personally not visited. The fear that we are giving our reputation and the imprimatur to universities that do not share, and countries that do not share our values. And that, in fact, we are giving them cover in exchange for money. And this is a subject that is of great debate in both of our communities, NYU and Yale. I receive emails on it pretty much every single day. And the central thought is a thought that we should not do these things. That, in fact, this kind of thing devalues the currency of our universities for states who will take advantage of us. And I have to say that as someone who has spent my adult life on human rights, this is something that I was concerned about myself. But as I have visited these universities, I see that there is a different kind of vision at work. You could see these campuses that are being created as enclaves or fortresses or oases of human rights in autocratic societies. Or you can see them as transmission belts of ideas, of human rights values, of ecumenism in a challenged world. That ideas like diversity and tolerance and the equal worth of every individual, or the fact that a community of many, many different groups can live together without killing each other, is actually a viable, successful model that can achieve hybrid vigor and a kind of special diversity that you would never see anywhere else. Now, the reason that I believe that this is such a powerful message, and by the way, I think this is a struggle. There will be challenges even as this image, global image, is trying to spread, is because there is really no alternative. Take my own country of origin, North Korea. South Korea, I'm from South Korea originally, but if North Korea were to open, if we wanted to make North Korea the kind of country that it should be, rather than the country that it is, what would be the first step? To open the outpost of a great global university, which would be, on the one hand, an oasis for human rights tolerance, and on the other hand, a transmission belt for these liberal values of diversity. And I saw this when I went to NYU Abu Dhabi. I met students who would have lived their lives in a very parochial existence, who by living in a global community felt that their strength was in reaching out. Corey Myers, when we first met and talked about why he came to Yale Law School, his own vision of what he was able to accomplish was dramatically expanded by having gone to a global university and living in a society that he found to be very different in terms of its values of democracy, equality, and others than in the United States. If this mission is to succeed, it is part of what universities need to do as a matter of outreach. In other words, not just tend our own nests, not just act locally, but see ourselves as a transmission belt, the secular university as a force for human rights through ecumenism. And that is what I think is the vision that both Guido Calabresi and John Sexton stand for. And finally, I say this because I am struck by forces within our own law that would try to seal ourselves off from these influences. In US law now, in constitutional law, there's a debate over whether you could or are allowed to cite to foreign sources of law. Think about this. Nino Scalia, John Roberts. We cannot look out over a crowd and pick out our friends. Or, this is America. We cannot look to foreign law. You should not interpret an American Constitution in light of these foreign values. It somehow sullies who we are. Now, to me, this is an astonishing statement. As I was at a baseball game, eating my Frankfurter and sauerkraut, and thinking, baseball is as American as Apfelkuchen. Or as I'm eating my kimchi burrito, and thinking, isn't it brilliant that finally they've put kimchi into a burrito? And the next step is falafel. And then we're really getting somewhere. And would anybody say it is un-American to borrow these foreign sources to put into an American piece of food? Or it is un-American to take The Office and transform it from a British television show into an American television show? Or that it's un-American to take Indian music and translate it into American music? Or would they say what my wife and I say to each other every night, which is, it is the fusing of different cultures in one family, our family, where of course the Koreans and the Irish are deeply intertwined, that is the source of our hybrid vigor. It is exactly what makes us Americans. It is the bonding that makes us Americans. It is the diversity that makes us Americanisms. It's our willingness to be ecumenical amongst ourselves and celebrate diversity here, and be willing to take that message, diversity works, tolerance works, human rights works, and take it to places where deep in their hearts, they wonder whether the system they've been living under is the very best system. When I was in China with NYU Shanghai, a young freshman student named Cash took me around on a tour, and he basically said this to me: I know that there's something else, and I never knew what it was until I was allowed to go to an American university and experience it. And he said, and now I don't want to simply live my life in this country, as big as it is, with its pollution and its corruption and the government that lies. I want to go somewhere else and experience something else. And we're in a situation now where that is very likely what he will do. So I close on this note, again apologizing for having gone on too long. At a personal level, Guido Calabresi and John Sexton carry the exact same message: faith, a vision of the university, a deep commitment to service, and to making the university a servant of everyone. And then a broader message about spreading the message of ecumenism through the university, through education, and bringing what is very special and unique about America to the world, as well as bringing what is special about the world to America. That's what I was thinking of in the car as I was coming up here. They told me, we want you to make a comment about John's speech. And I said, great, where's the text? And they said, there's not going to be one. It's going to be extemporaneous, so think it up while you're listening to him. That's what I tried to do, and thank you very much for listening.
Questions here. Since we're running late, may I invite you to the reception in the dining hall and ask your individual questions there in the dining hall to either our speaker or respondent. I thank them both for being here, and thank you all for being here this evening.